Watercolor Techniques. In our workspace, we have paper, watercolors, wire mesh, paper towel, plastic wrap, a sponge, masking tape, salt, oil pastel, wax crayon, and masking fluid. We also have a water cup and paintbrushes. Next, you're going to grid off your paper into 15 sections, so 3 rows of 5 or 5 rows of 3. They can be nice and evenly spaced, or you can just add different spots just to make sure you label them. Then you're going to label each section. Remember, there are 15. The first one is flat wash. Then gradient wash. And plastic wrap, salt resist, and oil and wax resist. Next will be blotting, sgraffito, splatter, lifting, and tape resist. Then dry brush, wet and wet, wet on dry, glazing, and masking fluid. When you're creating a flat wash, you want to start with a flat brush. You are going to wet your brush, and with just plain water, you are going to fill in the area with water to dampen that part of the paper. When the paper is still wet but no longer shiny, that's when you're going to add the color. So you're going to load up your brush with pigment, and then you're going to paint the area in a consistent direction. You can also use a large round brush when painting a flat wash. When creating a gradient wash, much like a flat wash, you are going to wet the full surface of where you plan to paint and let it still remain wet but not have the glossiness of the water. You may have to wait a little while, and the time will vary depending on the surface that you are adding water to. When it's no longer shiny but still wet, then you can begin to add colors, keeping in mind how colors mix together when they're side by side. So I'm going to start with a green, then a blue, and then a yellow. And then I clean out my brush and I go back over those, sometimes going up and then down, but keeping the horizontal motion. For the plastic wrap technique, you are going to paint the area with one or more colors. And while the paint is still wet, you are going to place a layer of plastic wrap. So right now, I am painting the area, and while my paint is still wet, I'm going to take a piece of plastic wrap, and I'm going to embrace some of the cracks and panes of plastic, and then I'm going to leave it there until it's dry. With salt, you're going to carefully paint an area of color, and then while the paint is still wet, you are going to add salt, and that is going to soak up the paint in some areas where it hits the paper. When it is dry, you will remove any salt that is left. With oil and wax resist, I'm demonstrating with an oil pastel and then a clear wax crayon. After that, I paint over it with the watercolor, and because of the nature of oil and wax both repelling water, it keeps whatever image you have drawn underneath. To create an area that has been blotted or looks like blotting, I'm going to paint an area, and then after I have painted that area while it's still wet, I'm going to use a paper towel. You can also use a sponge, but I've had more success with a paper towel to remove some of the pigment, and this is a soft way to remove it, so this would be good, for example, to create clouds. With Sgraffito, you're going to paint the area or surface with whatever colors you choose and in whatever fashion you choose. I'm just doing a flat wash to fill in this area and then letting it dry first. With Sgraffito, then I'm going to scratch it with a metal tool. I'm just using the edge of this wire, but I'm just carefully scoring the area. It's kind of hard to see on camera. I'm not cutting all the way through, just scratching the surface. For splattering paint, you can use a toothbrush or you can use wire mesh and a very wet brush to create splatters of color or colors on your paper. You may want to consider masking off other areas if you do not want to have splatter on those areas. With lifting, first you're going to start by painting an area or a surface with whatever color, typically a lighter value than what you paint later, and then you're going to let it dry. After that, when the paint has dried, you are going to choose a darker value and create an overpainting on top. After you've cleaned your brush and removed the watercolor from your brush, you're going to remove part of that paint with a clean but wet brush. And so you can create unique designs and show that part of the painting underneath through. With tape resist, you are going to tape off part of a picture or even cut out shapes with the masking tape. And then once you have set up your work area, then you're going to carefully paint over those areas once they're sealed off, and then when the painting is dry, you can remove the tape carefully. With dry brush, you're going to fill your brush with paint and then remove some of it by using a paper towel. After you've removed some of the wetness and the water, then you're going to use rapid brush strokes to create rough strokes with the paintbrush. This is good for rougher textures when you're trying to imitate or illustrate them. When you're creating wet and wet, you are going to wet the surface of your paper either with no pigment or with a certain color of watercolor. And then while that is still shiny and wet, you are going to add other colors, and they are going to charge the wet surface and create blooms. For wet on dry, I am creating a base layer, and then once it's dry, I am painting on top of the surface. With glazing, you're going to start by painting the area with different colors or one color. And then you can use a different color or colors when you overlap. So I'm just going to paint some lines to show you how glazing looks. When the previous layer has dried, I'm using a different color that is mostly water so that it can be seen through, and I am going the opposite direction over it. With masking fluid, you are going to use a colorless masking fluid. Some people also use rubber cement, and you are going to paint with a brush specific for this in the area that you do not want to be painted, and let that area dry. Once the masking fluid or rubber cement is dry, then you can paint over that area in whatever fashion you plan for your art. After the masking fluid or rubber cement dries, you are going to carefully rub the surface of the masking fluid to remove it carefully from your paper.